Welcome back for another deep dive. And today we're going to be exploring some fascinating insights from a book called Thinking Fast and Slow.
Mm.
It's by Daniel Kahneman, and it's had a really major impact on how we think about the way we think.
Oh, it really has. Kahneman won a Nobel Prize for this work, and it really does take us on this journey of exploration into human cognition,
Yeah.
how our minds work and sometimes how they don't work in ways we might not realize.
Yeah, absolutely. So
Mm.
i- let's kind of unpack some of this. So the book's core concept really
Yeah.
revolves around these two systems of thinking. You've got system one and you've got system two.
Right. So think of system one as your brain's autopilot.
Mhm.
It's fast, intuitive, automatic, really driven by emotion and instinct. And it's that system that helps you react quickly in everyday situations. So imagine you're driving and suddenly you need to swerve to avoid an obstacle. That's system one in action.
So it's like all of our quick judgments and our gut feelings.
Exactly. And while it's incredibly efficient, it can also lead to errors. And that's where system two comes in. System two is that slower, more deliberate analytical system. It's what you engage when you're solving a complex problem or making a really carefully considered decision.
So that's like our inner Sherlock Holmes, carefully examining the clues before making a decision.
Precisely. But engaging system two takes effort. It's like a mental muscle that needs to be exercised. And what's fascinating is how these two systems are constantly interacting and influencing our judgments and decisions.
So it's like a tug of war between instinct and reason.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And Kahneman uses some really compelling examples to illustrate this interplay, like the Muller-Lyer illusion. Have you ever seen
Yeah.
those two lines with arrows that look like different lengths, even though they're actually the same?
Oh, yeah, I've seen those. Like trippy, yeah.
It is. It's trippy. Even when you know the lines are the same length, your system one still perceives them as different.
Yeah.
And it just highlights how our intuition can sometimes lead us astray, even when we're aware of it.
So we're not always in control of how we perceive things.
Not entirely. And, Kahneman also talks about cognitive illusions, which are like illusions of thought. And he gives this great anecdote about a psychotherapy patient who, believes that all his previous therapists have failed him, but that this time it's going to be different because, this therapist really understands him.
Well, it's like classic wishful thinking.
Yes, exactly. And it just shows how easy it is to be fooled by our own minds.
Now, the book also delves into this concept of heuristics and biases,
Yeah.
which sounds a little intimidating.
It's not as complicated as it sounds. Heuristics are basically these mental shortcuts our brains use to make quick judgments. And they're incredibly useful in everyday life. Imagine trying to carefully analyze every single decision you make throughout the day. You'd be exhausted. So heuristics allow us to make, quick and efficient judgments.
So it's like these rules of thumb
Yeah.
that our brains have developed to
Yeah.
navigate the world a little easier.
Exactly. But the downside is that sometimes these mental shortcuts can lead to these systematic errors in our thinking, which are known as biases.
So it's not just that we're making random mistakes.
Yeah.
It's like our brains are wired to make predictable types of mistakes.
Precisely. And what's interesting is that these biases aren't limited to, certain types of people. We're all susceptible to them, regardless of our intelligence or education. So Kahneman, he explores several key heuristics in the book, like the availability heuristic.
That's the one where, like, we judge the likelihood of something happening based on how easily we can recall examples.
Right. Like, for example, if the news is constantly covering shark attacks, we might overestimate the actual risk of being attacked by a shark because those vivid examples are so readily available in our memory.
Yeah, our perception of risk is totally influenced by what's most salient in our minds.
Exactly. And it's interesting, Kahneman actually acknowledges falling prey to this bias himself when he was choosing examples for the book. He realized that he was relying too heavily on stories that were readily available to him, even if they weren't necessarily representative of the broader phenomenon he was describing.
Pretty humbling coming from a Nobel Prize winner.
It is. It highlights that we're all susceptible to these cognitive biases, even those of us who study them for a living. Another important heuristic is the representativeness heuristic.
Is that the one where we judge something based on how well it fits like a stereotype?
You got it. It's like judging a book by its cover. So he illustrates this with this experiment where participants were given a description of a person named Tom W., and then they were asked to estimate the probability of him being enrolled in various graduate programs. And the descriptions were designed to sound like stereotypes of certain fields.
So if the description sounded like a stereotypical computer science student, People assume Tom W. is more likely to be in a computer science program.
Exactly. And it led them to ignore the base rates, the actual percentage of students in each field. So even if the base rate for computer science students was relatively low, people were still heavily influenced by that representative stereotype.
Wow, so vivid descriptions can really cloud our judgment.
Absolutely. We tend to overemphasize that descriptive information
Hmm.
and ignore those statistical probabilities.
Yeah, this has implications for things like hiring decisions
Mhm.
and even jury deliberations.
Oh, it definitely does. And then there's this fascinating anchoring effect.
Is that the one where we get fixated on a number, even if it's irrelevant?
Yes, you got it. So Kahneman demonstrates this with an experiment where he had this wheel of fortune with numbers on it, right? And he would spin it. And then he would ask participants to estimate the percentage of African nations in the UN. And believe it or not, that completely random number that came up on the wheel actually influenced their estimate.
It really sounds,
Yeah.
just that random spin could sway their judgment.
It did, yeah. It highlights how easily our minds latch onto these arbitrary anchors, even when we know they're irrelevant.
So we've got these two systems of thinking, and then we've got these mental shortcuts
Yeah.
that can lead to bias. What else does Kahneman explore in this book?
Well, he goes into this concept of cognitive ease, which essentially means that our brains prefer effortless thinking.
So we're kind of lazy thinkers.
In a way, yes. We tend to gravitate towards the easiest answer, even if it's not the most accurate. Kahneman calls this the law of least effort, and it explains why we're often swayed by things that are easy to process, like rhyming slogans or catchy jingles.
Like our brains are saying, hey, this sounds good, this sounds familiar, let's just go with it.
Exactly, because our brains love that feeling of fluency and familiarity.
Yeah. So we like that easy thinking, but how does that, come into play when we're talking about more complex decisions,
Right.
like, financial decisions?
That's where Kahneman's work on prospect theory comes in, and this is all about how we make decisions under conditions of uncertainty.
So like
Mhm.
when we're deciding whether to invest in like
Yeah.
a particular stock or take a gamble on a new business venture.
Exactly. So Kahneman and his colleague, Amos Tversky,
Mm-hmm.
they developed prospect theory to try to explain these often irrational ways that we approach risk and reward. And a key principle of prospect theory is this idea of loss aversion.
Loss aversion. So that's the idea that
Yeah.
the pain of losing something outweighs the pleasure of
Yeah.
gaining something of equal value.
Precisely. Think about it. Losing $100 feels much worse than gaining $100 feels good, right? And so this emotional bias actually affects a lot of our decisions. So for instance, in negotiating, we might be more driven to avoid a loss than to secure a gain of the same size.
So it's almost like we're hardwired to feel that pain of a loss more acutely.
Exactly. And this can have real-world consequences. And Kahneman illustrates this with this really clever experiment called the mug experiment, where participants were randomly assigned to either be buyers or sellers of a simple coffee mug. And those who were given the mug, the sellers, they valued it much higher than the buyers who had to pay for it.
So simply owning that mug increased its perceived value to them.
It did. And this is a phenomenon known as the endowment effect, where we tend to overvalue things we own simply because they're ours. And it's another manifestation of that loss aversion.
I've definitely experienced that, like holding on to clothes that I never wear just because I can't bear to give them away.
Mhm.
And it feels like a loss, even though I'm not really losing anything.
We've all been there. It's a very human tendency. And speaking of human tendencies, Kahneman also delves into this concept of overconfidence.
So the tendency to overestimate our own abilities and knowledge.
Yes, and it's a really pervasive bias, and it can have, significant implications. His research on expert judgment is particularly eye-opening because he found that even in fields like finance and political forecasting, experts often perform no better than chance.
So all that expertise doesn't necessarily translate into more accurate predictions.
Not always. It turns out that in many complex domains, the world is just too unpredictable for even seasoned experts to make, accurate long-term forecasts. But what's even more interesting is that these experts often cling to this belief that they have special insights.
Yeah.
They suffer from what Kahneman calls the illusion of skill.
So it's not even just a lack of ability, but it's a lack of awareness about that lack of ability.
Exactly. And he shares this anecdote about presenting data to this financial firm, clearly demonstrating that their investment strategies were essentially rewarding luck as if it were skill.
And what was their reaction to that?
Indifference. They just couldn't accept the possibility that their success was largely due to chance. It's a really powerful illustration of how deeply ingrained that illusion of skill can be, especially in fields that value confidence and decisiveness.
So what does all of this, what does all this mean for us? Like, what are some practical takeaways that we can glean from thinking fast and slow?
Well, I think for starters, it encourages us to be more aware of our own cognitive biases. Understanding how our minds work
Right.
and sometimes how they don't work can really help us make better decisions in all areas of life.
So it's not just about understanding the psychology, but about applying it to our own lives.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, for example, understanding loss aversion can help us, be
Ah.
more effective negotiators. Knowing about the availability heuristic can make us, more critical consumers of media. And, being aware of the anchoring effect
Mhm.
can help us avoid being swayed by irrelevant information when we're making decisions.
So it's almost like you're giving us this toolkit for better thinking.
Exactly. Thinking fast and slow, it really empowers us to become more discerning thinkers, to recognize when to trust our intuitions and when we really need to engage that more deliberate system two thinking.
So it's not about eliminating system one altogether. It's just about knowing when to put system two in the driver's seat.
Right. It's about finding that right balance
Mhm.
between intuition and deliberation, knowing that both systems have their strengths and weaknesses.
So much of what we've been talking about has really focused on, our decision-making processes
Mm.
in the moment. But Kahneman also explores this idea that our memories of experiences
Hmm.
can be just as flawed as our judgments in the moment.
Oh, absolutely. He talks about the remembering self versus the experiencing self. And
Mhm.
this idea that, we tend to make decisions based on how we think we'll
Ah.
feel about something in the future rather than how we actually experience it in the moment.
So we're trying to predict
Yeah,
and control our future happiness.
exactly. And those predictions, they're not always accurate. So, Kahneman, he uses this fascinating example involving colonoscopies. So imagine two patients undergoing the procedure. And one experiences a brief period of abrasive really intense pain at the very end, while the other has a longer procedure, but with this gradual decrease in pain. So objectively, the second patient experienced less total pain, but they might remember the experience as more unpleasant because their memory is anchored to that final intense moment.
So our memories are biased towards the peak and the end of an experience
Right.
rather than the overall sum of the experience.
Precisely. And this can lead us to make choices that aren't in our best interests. So we might avoid a potentially beneficial medical procedure because
Yeah.
we're afraid of, a short burst of pain at the end.
Mm.
Or you might choose a vacation destination based on a few stunning photos rather than considering the overall experience.
Yeah, it really makes you think about how much control we really have over our own happiness, given that our memories could
Good
be
question.
so easily swayed by these peak end biases.
It is a humbling thought, but, I think that's the beauty of thinking fast and slow. It really encourages us to become more conscious architects of our own experiences. By understanding how our minds work, we can make more informed choices that align with our true values and goals.
Well said. And I think that's a perfect takeaway
Yeah.
from our deep dive into Kahneman's work. We've only scratched the surface of his insights, but
Mm.
hopefully this has encouraged you to kind of explore his ideas further.
Absolutely. It's a book that I highly recommend to anyone who wants to, delve deeper into that fascinating world of human cognition.
So until next time, remember to engage that system two thinking. Be mindful of those mental shortcuts and, maybe take those vacation photos
Yeah.
with a grain of salt. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.